Street Fighter 6 is an incredible game that finally broke me down and got me to love fighting games. A genre that I could never really get into properly, but it took a long time to get to this point, with my entire life spent experimenting with different attempts in the genre before Street Fighter 6 finally clicked with me. I play many games, of almost every genre. There isn't one that I haven't found a game to enjoy in. From shooters, action games, platformers, to turn-based RPGs, visual novels, adventure games, puzzle games, you name it, and I've probably played and loved it. But for the longest time, I could never get into fighting games. It was my Achilles heel, my white whale. It always felt like this untouchable, unobtainable goal, and despite some sprinkled attempts here and there, I just came to the conclusion that it wasn't for me. I figured that they would just be a blind spot, which I was fine with. Almost every person I know has many genres that they don't care for with their gaming preferences, so I figured that fighting games were that single outlier that didn't click with me. But throughout my time, there were several little breakthroughs that smashed that trend every now and then. Speaking of smashing, I grew up playing Smash Brothers like it was a religion. In fact, to this day, I'd still argue that the single game I've spent the most hours in is Melee, even though I absolutely didn't play it the way most people think of it today. Although the director of the franchise, Masahiro Sakurai, would probably disagree, or at least he would have back in the day. I would either constantly replay the adventure mode with every character, attempting every difficulty, or trying to obtain every trophy, or completing all the event matches, which I did over and over again, or the main bulk of my time, which was just spent playing matches against the CPU, over and over and over again. Random characters every time, usually at max difficulty, on whatever random stage, with all items turned on, cranked to the max spawn rate. I'd played Smash like the party game it was designed to be, and it wasn't until well after I stopped playing the game religiously did I ever discover the entire competitive scene around the game. Even though most people may look back on Smash Melee as a fighting game today, I never saw it that way. One of my other childhood obsessions was Mario Party. Actually, I'm still hopelessly obsessed with Mario Party. And to me, Smash and Mario Party were just two sides of the same coin. So even though I had that early exposure to a game that very much has a lot of classic fighting game love in its DNA, it never truly felt like that for me. I guess you could call it my true first exposure, but even today, when I think of Melee, I don't think of tier lists or frame data or any of that nonsense. I could barely name more than 5 pro players without looking up more of them. I think of the items, the stages, the countless hours spent on Mute City in the training mode, placing mines so that I could blow up every single car in the background. That was Melee to me, and that's what it'll always be. That was the first step in my journey to fighting games, with the next stop being a little bit of a step in the right direction. Soulcalibur 2 was a pretty big obsession of mine too. The inclusion of Link as a crossover fighter was no small part in getting me hooked, and it's probably still the best that this official Ocarina of Time version of Link has ever looked in a game. But a lot of my love of Soulcalibur 2 came from the personality of the game. The art style is incredible, the music is so heroic and inspirational, and the game was rich with content and customization. Weapon Master Mode felt like its own addicting mini RPG. Soulcalibur 2 started my love for the franchise, and I've been partially keeping up with it ever since. I always seek out a cabinet whenever I go to arcades, but Tekken doesn't resonate with me the same way that Soulcalibur does. Maybe it's the complexity of Tekken that goes over my head. Maybe the characters just don't stick with me. I don't know. Something about the style and atmosphere of Soulcalibur really works. I also love that the characters are all defined by their different weapon types. As a kid, I was easily drawn into any game that had cool looking weapons with unique character designs. It's no surprise in hindsight that something like Soulcalibur would catch my attention. As a fan of popular anime franchises like Dragon Ball and Naruto, I'd also fall into a lot of arena fighters and really love them, like the Budokai Tenkaichi series or Storm games. Also playing some of the more traditional 2D fighters like the classic Budokai series, but my nostalgia and love for these franchises drove my interest, as many of the more popular entries felt like love letters from the developers, in a way that reminds me of the extra content featured in the Smash games. I tried playing Dragon Ball FighterZ, of course, and despite how incredible that game is from a fan's viewpoint, with so many intricate references and Easter eggs within just the animations of the characters alone, I didn't really care all that much about actually playing it. The gameplay didn't hook me, and the true depth of the fighting game mechanics didn't really seem to shine unless you took the time to truly learn everything about the game. The barrier of entry was low, but the complexity and interest just felt too out of reach for someone of my skill level and familiarity with the genre. At this point, I was familiar enough with the fighting game genre, having dabbled in some other entries here and there like Injustice, but it still didn't fully click with me. Do you ever remember elusive games from your childhood? Ones that had a magical draw for you, but you rarely had chances to play them? And sometimes you didn't even know what they were called? You just had passing memories of sound effects, music, or levels in these games? Games that you may have seen at a friend's house or demos at a game store? When you're younger, they adopt this almost mythical, unobtainable quality about them. Well, I had a game like that for the longest time, and to this day, it still hits me with that same feeling. Everything about Marvel vs. Capcom 2 just blew me away. I'll tell you right now, if you're a kid walking through an arcade, there was not a single cabinet that could match the fucking presence of an MVC2 cabinet. I swear, I remember it glowing, calling to me like a siren every time I saw it. The roster was ginormous. At the time, it was the largest thing my little brain could comprehend. The music was so loud and exciting, and the visuals were just gorgeous. I recognized so many of the Marvel characters, and maybe like 2 of the Capcom characters, but I didn't care. This was my first exposure to any of the gorgeous 2D sprite art that Capcom was known for at the time. So all the characters and flashy effects and craziness, it just blew me away every time I saw it. I think MVC2, my fascination with it, the elusiveness of it, it just led me to always thinking about it in the back of my mind. Funny enough, the supposed rarity of it in my brain wouldn't actually just be a child fantasy, as the game basically became unattainable for decades outside of some minor re-releases and old console ports. It wasn't until the recently announced MVC collection that MVC2 would be legally playable anywhere since the HD remaster in 2009. But that was short-lived since it was taken off of Xbox Live and PlayStation Network just 4 years later. For a whole 10 years, MVC2 and much of the rest of the series was basically unobtainable until now. Ever since I first discovered MVC2, I always knew to seek it out whenever I visited arcades. One of my favorite pastimes is finding local arcades whenever I visit new towns, and my adoration for MVC2, despite my very limited technical knowledge of the game, eventually led me to also seek out the other games in the Versus series, like X-Men vs. Street Fighter, Marvel Superheroes. Whenever I could recognize that gorgeous bright artwork and flashy fast gameplay, I knew that was the arcade cabinet I would spend the most time with. And from there, I would start getting into whatever Street Fighter cabinets I could find, and got more into the series. Keep in mind, this was a very surface level adoration. I could recognize a decent chunk of the characters, I knew a few command inputs, but any actual knowledge of deep mechanics was never my thing. I pressed buttons, I saw colorful characters whack each other, that's all I needed, and all I really wanted. And that finally brings me to where I was right before the release of Street Fighter 6. Over the years, I slowly started warming up more and more to fighting games, but it wasn't until Street Fighter 6 that finally broke that limit. Street Fighter 6's pre-release material didn't impress me too much at first, although I was very into the art style and character design. Speaking from a gameplay perspective, there was nothing there for me. It didn't pique my interest because I was just a regular gamer, not a fighting gamer. I couldn't really recognize what I was watching. Time went on, more news and info started getting released, and the neurons in my brain started activating. I remember when Street Fighter V released, and most of the conversation towards the release of that game was how limited the content was, how disappointing the exclusivity deal was with Sony, and how broken the online was shaping out. As someone who wasn't a fan of fighting games at the time, at that point, I knew I was never going to purchase Street Fighter V. There were plenty of other games that had my attention. Even if it had somehow turned around to make a comeback, which it eventually did, I think in the eyes of the greater gaming community, it had already lost. But Street Fighter 6 was winning me over with every single new trailer, especially with a confidence and all the extra content that Street Fighter V never had. And this is also after the disappointment that was Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, another game that I was curious about, but all the pre-release info and previews just felt like disappointing news. Street Fighter 6, as the next mainline Capcom fighting game, was shaping up to be an incredible comeback. This was also smack dab in the middle of Capcom's renaissance and redemption arc that started with Resident Evil 7 and extended to Street Fighter, Monster Hunter, even Mega Man got a brand new entry in the series, although I'm still waiting for X9. Street Fighter 6's personality was palpable, the characters and art styles were striking, and every little gameplay preview and clip I watched just made it look more approachable and appealing in a way that other comparable fighting games just failed to do. When Street Fighter 6 finally released, I knew from the moment I booted up the game,
Street Fighter 6.
personality is a major thing that shines, right down to the menus and UI, a topic I'm particularly annoying about. Street Fighter 6 immediately leaves a great impression with the World Tour mode that adds nice incentive and introduction for new players, and has a big single player feature that is surprisingly missing in most fighting games. Just like how other giant gaming franchises are abandoning single player content like Call of Duty, Street Fighter 6 felt like it was making an effort that few fighting games ever do. Hell, Street Fighter V didn't launch with a story mode or even an arcade mode, and when it eventually received a story mode, it was also divisive.
What is this shot? What the fuck? What the fuck?
From what I've seen for many fighting games, you'll just get an arcade mode with a limited story that only serves longtime fans of the series. But Street Fighter 6 felt very much like a fighting game that isn't just working to appease its fans, but putting in the extra work to bring in as many outside newcomers as possible. And hey, it worked for me. Gameplay and combat is crunchy and enticing, but never crazy enough for a novice like me to be unable to follow it. It strikes a great balance between complex and crazy, but also simple and welcoming. Modern controls were an incredible idea, streamlining a control scheme that's nearly 35 years old in order to bring it up to more familiar, modern styles and standards. I prefer playing with the classic control scheme. It's how I started learning with the arcade cabinets, and I like having a bit more control over my character's actions, even if it means I lose a bit more frequently. But modern controls are genius, and just one of the many elements that shows that SF6 isn't just a game for fighting game players, it's for anyone who wants to just have fun. Now I don't mean that it's a game for everyone. If you don't like the idea of fighting games, then Street Fighter 6 won't do anything to change your mind. But if you're like me and always had a passing curiosity, well, I've never seen a fighting game like Street Fighter 6 that puts in so much effort to onboarding new players. The only comparison I could think of is Smash Bros., which always prioritized having a bunch of different modes and gameplay options so a lot of people could have fun with it. I jumped into SF6 with a bunch of friends and family members who were all more or less new to fighting games. We all had different exposures here and there with entries like Mortal Kombat or Ultimate MVC3, but having this little fight club of ours, all jumping in at the same time with more or less the same experience and skill level, it made Street Fighter 6 resonate with me more than ever. Like watching a bunch of chimps in a race to see who can be the first to type out Shakespeare. Online mode feels tailor-made for someone like me. The big virtual lobbies are super charming and reminds me of a more old-school approach to online multiplayer before everything was dominated by battle pass free-to-play schlock. Everything about SF6 feels like it was carefully thought out with how it would work with anyone who is brand new to the franchise. The robust tutorial mode is accessible, straightforward, and breaks everything down to the most basic possible level. It even goes so far as to explain common fighting game terms and mechanics, which is wonderful for someone like me. The tutorial walks through step-by-step guides for every character so new players can worry less about difficulty or mechanics and just lean towards anyone that appeals to them. From my limited understanding, Chun-Li is a complex character that takes a lot of skill to master, but so far I really love her playstyle and unique elements, like her quick walk speed and special stances to create even more potential combos and strategies. I was worried that when I got into Street Fighter 6, I would quickly get bored like I did with Dragon Ball FighterZ and Injustice, but now, after it, I can't wait for more. Riot Games has 2XKO. Yeah, it's still a terrible name. And it'll be a great start for many people who are still looking to get into the genre without sinking a ton of money at first. Although Street Fighter 6 is regularly on sale, so keep an eye out. There are a handful of other popular free-to-play fighting games like Brawlhalla or Multiverses, but they're platform fighters that mostly take inspiration from Smash Bros., whereas League Fighter draws major inspiration from the Versus series. It doesn't seem nearly as approachable or friendly for newcomers, but hopefully it opens the floodgates even more for those interested. Speaking as a fan of all games, who has a very casual and limited perspective, fighting games to me have always come across like they've struggled to include enough features or incentives to bring in new players. Whether that's actually the case or not, I see other gaming franchises with brand new entries that always felt so feature rich, with interesting new content, mechanics, reasons to jump in. But fighting games and big franchises always felt like they didn't do enough to win people like me over, which is a shame. I can't even imagine the amount of work that goes into creating a unique fighting game with mechanics and animations and vibrant characters, but whenever it's held up to something like Smash Bros., it always felt like they could never compare. Smash Bros. Always had dozens of characters with hundreds of hours of extra content to unlock, challenges, story modes, collectibles, and that's not even including all the unique stages that are created that can have an impact on gameplay. The optional items that can be used, the dozens of hours of music, even the short demos in Brawl to introduce players to the franchise as they make up this wonderful crossover. Smash Bros. Has always felt like a video game that celebrates video games, all wrapped up in a neat platform fighter party game package. And growing up with it, it always felt like I was spoiled, because anytime I saw other fighting games, they almost never felt like they could compare. Whether this is a fair comparison or not, it is the comparison that many non-fighting game fans make. While Street Fighter is the highest grossing fighting game franchise when you include all the arcade and home console releases, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate is the single best-selling fighting game of all time. It is the one to beat all the others, and honestly, looking at it objectively, I think it earns that spot wholeheartedly. Don't get me wrong, Smash would never exist without other classic fighting games and especially Street Fighter. Its influence in the entire gaming community is unmatched and will forever be cemented as one of the greatest video game franchises. But Smash Ultimate excels in a way that I think very few games ever do, not just fighting games. So what I'm trying to say is, as a lifelong Smash fan, Street Fighter 6 is fighting to prove that fighting games can be so much more than what they are. Street Fighter 6 is fighting to prove that the fighting game community deserves what the Smash Bros. Community has been getting for years now. And because of its hard work, I'm more interested than ever in trying so many other fighting games and series like Fatal Fury, Tekken, 2XKO, Guilty Gear, so many franchises that I otherwise would never even think about. SF6 is continuing strong with DLC, and from what I can tell, it has a bright future ahead of it. I haven't dabbled in the DLC yet, but I certainly plan on it once I've spent more time practicing with the base roster. Despite revisiting the game every couple of weeks, having spent over 50 hours in it, I've only played around with less than half of the base roster. I can't wait to spend even more time in Street Fighter 6 for a long time to come. MVC is making a comeback with the collection releasing soon, and the modding community being stronger than ever for the current MVC releases. Street Fighter 6 helped me finally click with fighting games, but not just because it's a fighting game, but just like Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, it's just an incredible game. And in fact, it was one of my personal games of the year in 2023. It was a competitive year with games like Baldur's Gate 3 and Tears of the Kingdom, but it's criminal that it didn't get more recognition and attention. If you have any interest at all, right now, I couldn't recommend it more. Like I mentioned before, it's regularly on sale, sometimes for half of the retail price, and there's even demos available for it. So you have a chance to try it out for totally free and see if you vibe with the gameplay. It's even better if you jump in with friends who are also new to the series. I can't emphasize enough how much of a great time I've had just playing online matches for hours on end, as we all try, and repeatedly struggle, to pull off the most basic combos and inputs. There's fully functional crossplay too, so there's absolutely no limit regarding how you choose to play with your friends. I still have so much left to do with SF6, completing the world tour, trying out the rest of the roster, and climbing the online ranks, but Street Fighter 6 has a real magical charm that shines through in nearly every aspect. Maybe with my limited history of fighting games, I was always going to enjoy Street Fighter 6 given my enjoyment of Super Smash Bros., Soulcalibur, Marvel vs. Capcom 2, but I don't think that's the case with this. This is different and special. I can't give a definitive final verdict. I wouldn't call this video a review, but believe me when I tell you that Street Fighter 6 is one of the best fighting games you'll ever play, and one of the absolute best games to release in 2023. I hope above all else that it makes you fall in love with fighting games just like it did for me.